The first question obviously is for you, Christopher. Since Mr. McGrath has just finished, I would put the question to you, which is, if God does not exist, on what basis can anyone say this action is right or this action is wrong?
So whoever asked that only just came into the room, right? I mean, I can't believe that I didn't say what I thought about it. But I won't repeat it, because actually what Dr. McGrath just said I thought was unusually good on this point. You'll recall what he said on the Dostoevskian matter. If God exists, we have to do what he says. If he doesn't, we can do what we like. Now, just apply this for a second in practice and in theory. Is it not said of God's chosen people, and is it not said to them by God in the Pentateuch, that they can do exactly as they like to other people? They can enslave them, they can take their land, they can take their women, they can destroy all their young men, they can help themselves to all their virgins, they can do what anyone who had no sense of anything but their own rights would be able to do, but in this case with divine permission. Doesn't that make it somewhat more evil? In Iran, where I've been to all three axes of evil countries, by the way, and I think I'm the only writer who can say that. You're not allowed to sentence a woman who is a virgin to death, even though she may have committed, in the eyes of the mullahs, a capital crime, perhaps by showing her hair too often or her limbs. She can't be sentenced to death. But religious law means she can be raped by the Revolutionary Guards and she's not a virgin anymore. And then they can kill her. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law used to be considered the motto of Satanism, as I recall. Divine permission given to people who think they have God on their side enables actions that a normal, morally normal unbeliever would not contemplate. The mutilation of genitalia of children. Who would do that if it wasn't decided that God wanted it? Just as when the poet in England gets the Poet Laureateship, they start to write drivel instead of poetry for some reason. It's the king's scrofula the other way around. Morally normal and intelligent people find themselves saying fatuously wicked things when this subject comes up. The suicide bombing community is entirely faith-based. The genital mutilation community is entirely faith-based. Slavery is mandated by the Bible. You keep hearing how many abolitionists were Christians. Well, it was about time that they took a stand against it, having mandated it for so long. So it's not even a tautology, I think, to say that there's a relationship between the human impulse to do evil, to be selfish, to be self-centered, to be greedy, and a contrast between that and faith, because given only faith, mountains can be moved, and millions of people who would never normally acquiesce in evil are brought to it straight away and with ease, and with self-righteousness. That's my answer to that. And the questioner did not answer my challenge. Name an ethical statement made or action performed by a believer in the name of faith that couldn't have been by an infidel, and name, if you can, this is easier, a wicked action that could only be mandated by faith, and then you'll see how silly your question was, whoever you were. To see something that is awe-inspiring, and don't look to blood-stained old myths. Now, why now? Why am I doing this now, people ask? Well, I'll tell you why now, because in the last few years it's become impossible to turn a page of a newspaper without being, as the religious would say, offended. In other words, I don't think I sound self-pitying if I say that I'm offended that a cartoonist in a tiny democratic country in Scandinavia, Denmark, can't do his job without a death threat, and that no American magazine or newspaper would reprint those cartoons, either to elucidate the question or in solidarity. I'm offended that civil society in Iraq is being destroyed, leveled by the parties of God. I'm offended that people in this country believe that they have the right to advocate the teaching of garbage to children under the fatuous name of intelligent design. I believe that we're... I thought you'd never clap. Just as I believe that where religion ends, philosophy begins, where alchemy ends, chemistry begins, where astrology ends, astronomy begins, and now the people will say, well, let's give equal time to astrology in the schools. It's nonsense, dangerous and sinister nonsense. The Pope says AIDS may be bad, but condoms are much worse. What kind of moral teaching is this? And how many people are going to die for such dogma? You see what I mean? So I'll be very brief. There's an end to this, an end particularly to the cultural cringe that says that if someone can claim to be a religious spokesman, they are entitled to respect. I have to say it in your presence, sir. I think that the title Reverend is something people should be more concerned to live down than to live up to. Thank you.
Against the motion, Mr. Hitchens.
Unanswered questions. Amazing. No one, though they were asked repeatedly, would say whether they thought Stephen Fry, my friend, was in a state of mortal sin or not. They wouldn't tell you. Something about the question brought out their inner coward. Well, I say that homosexuality is not just a form of sex, it's a form of love, and it deserves our respect for that reason. That when my children were young, I'd have been proud to have Stephen as their babysitter, and I told them they were lucky. And if anyone came to my door as a babysitter wearing holy orders, I'd call first a cab and then the police.
Anti-theism is a philosophy for the strong. It's a philosophy for the intelligent. But Christianity has something to say for people who are not strong, who are not intelligent, for people who fall down. I would like to know what your anti-theism has to offer in the way of dignity or hope for those who are not as intelligent as you, who are not as strong as you.
Who, not just that there is a creator, but in other words, not a deist belief that there must be a first cause, but a theist belief that there's someone who knows and watches and cares. What about Fräulein Freisel in Austria, whose father kept her in a dungeon where she didn't see daylight for 24 years and came down most nights to rape and to sodomize her, often in front of the children who were the victims of the previous attacks and offenses? Imagine how she must have begged him. Imagine how she must have pleaded. Imagine for how long. Imagine how she must have prayed every day, how she must have beseeched heaven. Imagine, for 24 years, and no answer at all. Nothing. Nothing. Imagine how those children must have felt. Imagine what they felt when they saw one of their number, the dead twin, being borne away from neglect on top of everything else. Now, I have to ask you, if you can be morally or ethically serious and postulate such a question. No, that had to happen. And heaven did watch it with indifference, because it knows that score will later on be settled. So it was well worth going through it. She'll have a better time next time. I don't see how you can look anyone in the face, or live with yourself and say anything so hideously, wickedly immoral as that, or even...
In his comment, one of the few he's made on the institutionalization of rape and torture and maltreatment of children in Catholic institutions, he has said it's a very severe crisis which involves us, he said, in the following: in the need for applying to these victims the most loving pastoral care. Well, I'm sorry. They've already had that. The rape and torture of children is not something to be relativized. It's not something to be excused as a few bad priests. It's the crime that cries out for punishment. It's the thing that if we were accused of on this side of the House, we would die rather than admit. And if we were guilty of it, would kill ourselves.
Do yourself and your faith the honor of saying it's faith. Don't say it's science-based.
The argument would be...
You won't get away with it.
Look, the argument would be, Christopher, is that if the universe exploded into being out of nothing, then miracles are possible, because the greatest miracle of all has already occurred. The question is, have miracles occurred in the first century? That requires another debate whereby we have to look at the historical evidence and see. And if it is true that that Jesus really did come and say and do the things that the New Testament writer said he did, then whatever he teaches is true, because if he rose from the dead, he was God. If he taught that there will be an intervention, then there will be. That's the argument. I don't have time to support it.
Now, a sentence or two from David Hume would correct what you said. A miracle is defined not as a part of the natural order, but as a suspension of the order. That it's a suspension of what it starts. You may not do that. However, if you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred, or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely,
that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake. And in each case you must, and especially if you didn't see it yourself and you're hearing it from someone who says that they did. I would go further and say the following. I'll grant you that it would be possible to track the pregnancy of the woman Mary, who's mentioned about 3 times in the Bible, and to show that there was no male intervention in her life at all. But yet she delivered herself of a healthy baby boy. I can say, I don't say that's impossible. Parthenogenesis is not completely unthinkable, but it does not prove that his paternity is divine. And it wouldn't prove that any of his moral teachings were thereby correct. Nor, if I was to see him executed one day and see him walking the streets the next, would that show that his father was God, or his mother was a virgin, or that his teachings were true, especially given the commonplace nature of resurrection at that time and place. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened, and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. So I'll give you all the miracles, and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty... I think it will one day be admitted with shame that it might have been in error to say that AIDS is bad as a disease, very bad, but not quite as bad as condoms are bad, or not as immoral in the same way. I say it in the presence of his grace, and I say it to his face. The preachings of his church are responsible for the death and suffering and misery of millions of his brother and sister Africans, and he should apologize for it. He should show some shame. One of the reasons why I have the lurid subtitle I do, my book, that Religion is a Poison, is that it makes ordinary moral people, compels them, forces them, in some cases orders them, to do disgusting, wicked, unforgivable things. There's no expiation for the generations of misery and suffering that religion has inflicted in this way and continues to inflict, and I still haven't heard enough apology for it.
Christopher, I've got to call you down on referring to circumcision as genital mutilation. My son cried more at his first haircut than he did at his bris. And statistically... You weren't
doing it right then.
Statistically, the only long-term effect that it seems to have on people is it increases their chances of winning a Nobel Prize.
I can't find the compulsory mutilation of the genitals of children a subject for humor in that way, or flippancy in that way. Maimonides says very plainly that it's designed to repress sexual pleasure, to deprive a male child as far as possible of the opportunity of that, as a result of this disgusting practice. That a person as humane as yourself can sit here and think of that as a fit subject for humor shows what I mean. Religion makes morally normal people say and do disgusting and wicked things, and you've just proved my point for me. Shame on you for saying what you just said. Shame on you for saying it about your own son, my God.
Let's move on.
Yes, let's.
What next? Cutting the labia of little girls. At least Judaism doesn't do that.
This is a question.
What if a Muslim was to say to you just now, my little girl cried more at her first haircut than when I cut off her clitoris? What would you think of me if I was to say such a disgusting thing?
Well,
remember, we are not talking about detail here. We're talking about whether religion makes people behave better. For condemning my friend Stephen Fry for his nature, for saying you couldn't be a member of our church, you're born in sin. He's not being condemned for what he does, he's being condemned for what he is. You're a child made in the image of God. Oh no, you're not. You're a faggot. And you can't join your church and you can't go to heaven. This is disgraceful, it's inhuman, it's obscene, and it comes from a clutch of hysterical, sinister virgins who've already betrayed their charge in the children of their own church. I think it was David Hume who put it slightly vulgarly. This was again about the virgin birth, I think. Which is more likely, that the whole natural order is suspended, or that a Jewish minx should tell a lie?
If there is no supervisory being, then what do we base morality on? Is it based on who has the might at any given time? Who's in power? What is morality based on? If there is no order to the universe, and therefore some being, some force that ordered it, then who determines what is right and wrong, what is moral and immoral? You use very religious terms interchangeably while you attack the idea of a God. There is nothing immoral if there's nothing in charge.
When you see something otherwise surprising to you, such as a good person acting in a wicked manner, it's very often because they believe they're under divine orders to do so. Stephen Weinberg puts it very well. He says, left to themselves, evil people will do evil things and good people will try and do good things. If you want a good person to do a wicked thing, that takes religion. I do not think that any person looking at a newborn baby would think, how wonderful, what a gift, but now just let's start sawing away at its genitalia with a sharp stone. Who would give them that idea if not the godly? And what kind of argument from design is this? Babies are not born beautiful, they're born ugly. They need to be sawn a bit because the handiwork of God is such garbage. Well, honestly,
it's rubbish. Only religious people reading scriptures of some sort have done wicked things in the history of the world.
Actually, secular criminality on the political level wasn't really possible until pretty much the late 18th century, because the religious monopoly on violence and cruelty and torture and slavery and so on was so intense. The long cultural process is to try and move people up to a cultural and intellectual